July 1st, 1916. The sun rose over the trenches of northern France, and with it, thousands of British soldiers climbed out of their dugouts, marching forward into what they believed would be a decisive breakthrough. By sunset, nearly 60,000 of them lay dead or wounded, the worst single day in British military history. What went so horribly wrong? How did a meticulously planned offensive turn into one of the greatest disasters of World War I? To understand the scale of this catastrophe, we need to step back and examine the grim reality of the Western Front. Since 1914, the war in Europe had ground to a brutal stalemate. The once fluid battles of maneuver had collapsed into trench warfare. Long fortified lines stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland, where soldiers faced artillery barrages, machine gun fire, and the ever-present horror of gas attacks. Each side had spent nearly 2 years launching offensives that gained little more than a few miles of devastated land, only to be countered by equally ferocious counterattacks. The Battle of the Somme was meant to break this deadlock, to turn the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. Instead, it became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with modern warfare. The British High Command, led by General Sir Douglas Haig, believed the key to victory lay in sheer firepower. The plan was simple but tragically flawed. An unprecedented week-long artillery bombardment would obliterate the German defences, allowing British troops to simply walk across no man's land and seize their objectives. But the reality was far different. Many of the shells failed to explode. The deep German bunkers held firm, and when the barrage lifted on July 1st, the defenders were ready. As the British advanced in rigid, tightly packed waves, they were met with a wall of machine gun fire. Within minutes, entire battalions were wiped out. Some units, like the Newfoundland Regiment, suffered casualty rates of over 90%. By the end of the day, the British had gained almost nothing, except an appalling body count. Yet, despite the carnage, the battle was far from over. What followed was a campaign that would stretch on for months, consuming men and resources on an unimaginable scale. But how did the battle evolve beyond its disastrous first day? And did the British learn from their mistakes? Let's dive deeper into the tactics, leadership, and the unrelenting struggle that defined the rest of the Somme offensive. The summer of 1916 was supposed to bring victory. Instead, it brought one of the most catastrophic bloodbaths in military history. The Battle of the Somme was meant to break the stalemate of trench warfare, shatter the German lines, and force a breakthrough on the Western Front. Instead, it became a symbol of strategic miscalculations, outdated tactics, and the horrifying realities of industrial warfare. But why the Somme? Why was this particular stretch of land chosen for one of the most infamous battles of the First World War? By 1916, the Western Front had ground to a brutal standstill. The war, once imagined to be swift and decisive, had become a war of attrition, with soldiers living in squalid trenches, surrounded by mud, disease, and the ever-present threat of death. Across France and Belgium, the front lines barely moved, despite massive offensives. The French in particular were being pushed to the brink at Verdun, where relentless German attacks threatened to break their army entirely. The British, eager to relieve pressure on their allies, agreed to launch a major offensive along the river Somme. It was not the most strategically significant location, but it was where British and French forces could coordinate an attack. And critically, it was where Britain's rapidly expanding army, largely made up of new, inexperienced recruits, would get its first major test. General Douglas Haig, the British commander, was convinced that a massive artillery bombardment would wipe out German defences. The plan was simple: shell the enemy for days, obliterate their trenches, cut the barbed wire, and leave nothing but craters and corpses. Once the shelling stopped, British and French infantry would walk across no man's land and claim victory with minimal resistance. On paper, it seemed logical. In practice, It was one of the greatest miscalculations in military history. The Germans had spent years fortifying their defences. Their trenches were deep, reinforced with concrete, and positioned to withstand prolonged bombardment. Their machine guns were not destroyed. Their barbed wire remained intact. And when the artillery stopped, they knew exactly what was coming. The British had expected a walkover. Instead, their soldiers stepped into a storm of bullets, artillery, and shrapnel. The Battle of the Somme was not just a battle, it was a lesson written in blood. Over a century later, it remains one of the most infamous days in military history. And as we examine what happened next, the scale of the disaster becomes even clearer. Before we dive into that, though, I need you to hit the subscribe button if you love learning about history. The British and French High Command believed they had devised a battle plan that would break the stalemate on the Western Front. It hinged on one key assumption, that a week-long artillery bombardment would obliterate German defences, destroy barbed wire, and leave nothing but rubble and dazed survivors when the infantry went over the top. The scale of this bombardment was staggering. Over 1.5 million shells rained down on German lines, turning the battlefield into a moonscape. British officers were so confident in its success that they assured their men that the attacking infantry would be able to walk across no man's land unopposed. But this assumption was catastrophically flawed. Many of the shells fired were defective, failing to explode, and those that did often landed in empty stretches of land rather than striking German bunkers. Worse still, the crucial high-explosive shells needed to destroy barbed wire were in short supply, leaving much of it intact. Instead of clearing the way for the British advance, the artillery barrage did little more than warn the Germans that an attack was imminent. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, 1916, the whistles blew, and thousands of British and French troops climbed out of their trenches and began their advance across no man's land. In keeping with orders from High Command, they moved in long, slow lines, carrying full packs and heavy gear, meant to reinforce the notion of an unstoppable wave. The planners of the battle believed that the Germans had been so devastated by the artillery that there would be no need for speed or maneuvering. But deep within the German lines, thousands of well-trained defenders had been sheltering in fortified bunkers, dug deep into the chalky earth of the Somme. As soon as the bombardment stopped, German soldiers rushed to their positions, set up their machine guns, and prepared for slaughter. The British, weighed down by their equipment and advancing in predictable formations, were easy targets. The Germans opened fire with devastating precision. Machine gun nests tore into the advancing waves, cutting men down by the hundreds before they had even crossed their own parapets. Artillery shells burst in no man's land, sending shrapnel slicing through ranks of soldiers. Some units were almost entirely wiped out before they even reached the German wire. The barbed wire that was supposed to have been destroyed remained intact, trapping many in the open, where they were mown down mercilessly. Those few who did reach enemy lines often found themselves face to face with unscathed German defenders, firing point-blank into the oncoming attackers. By nightfall, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. The British alone had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties in a single day, including 19,000 dead, the worst loss in the history of the British Army. Entire battalions had been annihilated in minutes. The sheer brutality of the first day of the Somme was a horrifying testament to the failures of outdated tactics and the brutal efficiency of modern warfare. What was meant to be a grand breakthrough had become an unthinkable catastrophe. But the Battle of the Somme was far from over. Despite the horrific losses, the British High Command refused to abandon the offensive. The battle would grind on for another 4.5 months, dragging hundreds of thousands more men into its merciless grip. The real question was no longer whether the Somme would be a victory, but how much more blood it would demand. The Battle of the Somme wasn't just a military catastrophe, it was a human one. For the soldiers on the front lines, July 1st, 1916 was a waking nightmare. The men who had trained for months, some for years, believed they were marching toward a historic victory. Instead, they were walking into hell. Letters and diaries from that day paint a grim picture: the sickening realization that the artillery had failed, the eerie silence before the storm of machine gun fire, and the sight of comrades falling in waves, some never even firing their rifles before they were cut down. In the words of one British soldier, "We were walking as if in a dream." Then the world exploded. The psychological toll was immense. Many soldiers suffered from what was then called shell shock, a term that barely captured the scale of mental trauma. Imagine watching your entire unit obliterated in minutes, friends vanishing in clouds of blood and dirt, bodies piling up in the wire as orders demanded another advance. Some men broke down completely, unable to move, while others became numb, stumbling forward through the carnage. The Somme was not just a killing field. It was the birthplace of a modern understanding of combat trauma. Men who survived the day were never the same. Yet even in the face of slaughter, there was heroism. Medics braved no man's land, dragging the wounded back under relentless fire, often becoming casualties themselves. Officers, knowing full well that the attack was doomed, still led their men over the top, sometimes marching with their canes, as if defying death itself. Some soldiers carried on with extraordinary bravery, charging machine gun nests or shielding their comrades from explosions. But heroism couldn't change the outcome. The first day of the Somme had shattered the British Army, and by nightfall, 19,000 lay dead. Lieutenant Raymond Penniman of the Royal Canadian Regiment, writing his last letter home on October 4, 1916, before going missing in action in a German trench, wrote of the Somme, "My dear folks, rain, rain and more rain. More rain, more mud, more duds, as the Tommies say, all of which means that the rain will soften the earth to such an extent that the shells will not go off. A bad shell we call a dud. We are trying to keep dry with a small piece of canvas, and to say the most, it is rotten. The war still goes on with much gusto, and Fritz still goes lucky. It will take time, but we will get him. The weather may save his luck, but from what I see will not hinder much. The other day we captured some Marines. They must be short when they put their sailors into land battles. I would like to know what the Hun big bugs think. We know what their soldiers think. They are fed up with fighting and throw their hands up without a fight. My leave is coming soon, and I am going to forget the war for a while." Lieutenant Penniman went missing 4 days later while leading an assault on a German trench. After taking the trench, the Canadians came under intense rifle grenade fire, which effectively wiped them out. The Somme was meant to be the breakthrough that ended the war. Instead, it became a symbol of its horror. And as the sun set on July 1st, the true cost of the day's failure had yet to be realized. The battle was far from over. Despite the catastrophic losses on July 1st, the British High Command refused to abandon the offensive. General Douglas Haig remained convinced that attrition would wear down the German defences, and so the battle continued for 4 more grueling months. With each new wave of attacks, British and French troops pressed forward, capturing devastated villages and battered trench lines at an unbearable cost. The Germans, entrenched in well-fortified positions, fought ferociously to hold their ground, launching counterattacks that turned the Somme into a continuous bloodbath. But by now, the battle had become something even more horrifying. It was no longer about territorial gains, but about sheer endurance, a grinding war of attrition that consumed men and resources at an unprecedented rate. Desperation on the battlefield led to innovations, some of which would define the future of warfare. On September 15, 1916, the British unleashed a secret weapon, the tank. These early armoured vehicles were crude, unreliable, and often broke down before reaching enemy lines. But when they did work, they had a shocking effect, rolling over trenches and barbed wire with ease. The sight of these mechanical beasts sowed terror among the German defenders, but their impact was limited. Mechanical failures and slow speeds meant they could not break the deadlock, though they hinted at a new era of mechanized warfare that would come to dominate the next World War. By the time the battle finally ended in November 1916, the Allies had advanced a mere 7 miles. 7 miles, for over 4 months of relentless fighting, for over 600,000 Allied casualties, for nearly 500,000 German dead and wounded. The landscape was unrecognizable, a wasteland of craters, corpses, and mud. The Somme had been intended as a breakthrough, but it had become something else entirely, a horrifying symbol of the futility of trench warfare and one of the bloodiest campaigns in human history. But was it all in vain? The British and French had inflicted enormous losses on the Germans, sapping their ability to launch future offensives. The price had been unthinkable, yet some argued that the battle helped set the stage for eventual victory. Was the Somme a necessary sacrifice or a catastrophic failure of military strategy? The Battle of the Somme failed in its strategic goal of collapsing the German defences, but it did succeed in forcing the Germans to divert resources from Verdun, ultimately relieving pressure on the French. The cost, however, was staggering. More than just a military failure, the Somme became a symbol of the futility and wastefulness of World War I. The sight of men charging into machine gun fire, the stories of entire battalions wiped out in minutes, and the haunting images of a cratered landscape all came to define the brutal nature of trench warfare. The battle cemented the perception of British and Allied commanders as out of touch, clinging to outdated tactics in the face of modern weaponry. Yet the lessons of the Somme were not entirely in vain. The British Army, initially untested on such a scale, learned hard lessons about artillery coordination, infantry tactics, and the need for more effective combined arms strategies. These lessons, painful as they were, laid the groundwork for later successes in 1918, when more flexible and coordinated attacks helped break the German lines for good. So, was the Somme a necessary sacrifice, or was it one of the greatest military blunders in history? The debate rages on. It was a battle of unimaginable loss, yet it also marked a turning point in how modern war was fought. One thing is certain. July 1st, 1916 remains the bloodiest day in British military history, and the Battle of the Somme endures as a testament to both the horrors and the resilience of those who fought in its trenches. If you liked this video, you'll love this one exploring the connection between World War I and the subsequent conflict in the Middle East.